The grand throne room of the Celestial Palace sparkled with crystalline light, its walls embedded with stars that had been captured and preserved eons ago. Princess Lyra sat on her silver throne, watching yet another suitor walk away with slumped shoulders. "That makes 500, Emperor Vale said, rubbing his temples. His daughter had just rejected the crown prince of the Nebula Kingdom, who had arrived with a fleet of living starships as his offering. He breathed too loudly, Lyra said, examining her nails that shimmered with stardust, and his tentacles were an awful shade of blue. The Emperor looked at his chief advisor, Master Ray, who could only shrug in response. They had gone through every eligible royal from all 4 spiral arms of the galaxy. The princess had rejected them all. "My dear," Vale started, his voice gentle but firm, "you understand that the Empire needs an heir. Our bloodline has ruled for 10,000 years." Lyra stood up, her dress rippling like liquid moonlight. "And that's exactly why I can't settle for just anyone. None of them are worthy." The rejected prince's guards were still carrying out his gifts, rare metals that could bend reality, dragons bred in the heart of dying stars, and maps to hidden dimensions. Lyra didn't even glance at them. The prince of the Shadow Collective was too tall. She counted off on her fingers. The High Commander of the Light Brigade was too short. The Duchess of the Quantum Realm talked too much about physics. They were all powerful rulers, Master Ray pointed out. Any of them would have made a fine match. Lyra walked to the massive window that overlooked the capital city. Below, vehicles zipped between buildings that stretched up into the purple sky. 3 moons hung overhead, each one housing billions of citizens of the Empire. "Power isn't everything," she said. "I want someone who can surprise me. Someone who isn't just another boring royal who thinks they can impress me with their wealth or their armies." Vale stood up, his imperial robes flowing around him. "The law is clear, Lyra. By your next birthday, you must choose a partner. The Empire cannot risk having no heir." "Then change the law," Lyra shot back. "You're the Emperor. Laws that have stood for 10,000 years cannot be changed on a whim," Master Ray said. "Even the Emperor must follow tradition." Lyra turned back to the window, watching as a group of space whales drifted between the towers, their crystal fins catching the light of the setting sun. She had everything. Beauty that made stars seem dim, intelligence that could solve quantum puzzles, and power that could reshape planets. Yet she felt empty. "What about the new species?" Master Ray suddenly said. "The ones who just joined the galactic community." Vale's eyes lit up. "Ah yes, the humans. They're sending their first diplomatic mission next week." Lyra laughed, the sound like tinkling crystals. "The primitives who just figured out faster than light travel. Please, they probably still eat actual food instead of consuming pure energy. They are different," Master Ray said carefully. "Their civilization developed in unusual ways. They might surprise you." "Everything about them is primitive," Lyra said. "Their technology, their culture, their very bodies. They don't even have backup consciousness storage. When they die, they actually stay dead." "Give them a chance," Vale said. "Their representative will be attending the Stellar Ball. Just talk to them." Lyra walked toward the door, her dress leaving a trail of starlight. "Fine. I'll talk to the human, but don't expect anything. I've seen creatures born in black holes, beings made of pure thought, and royals who can dance between dimensions. What could a simple human possibly offer that would impress me?" As she left, Vale and Master Ray exchanged knowing looks. They had both studied human history. If there was one thing humans were good at, it was proving people wrong. Little did Princess Lyra know, her entire world was about to change, all because of a species she thought was beneath her notice. The first human diplomatic ship entered the Empire's space with little fanfare. Unlike the grand vessels of other species, the Earth ship was simple, functional, and almost plain, a reflection of their practical approach to space travel. James stood at the observation deck, watching as they approached the capital planet. 3 moons circled the massive world, each one a thriving city in itself. The sight would have seemed impossible just a few years ago, before humans discovered they weren't alone in the universe. Approaching docking station, the ship's AI announced, "All diplomatic personnel prepare for arrival." Unlike the other diplomats who wore elaborate robes or projected energy fields around themselves, James wore a simple black suit. His only decoration was a small earth pin on his lapel. At 32, he was considered young for such an important position, but he had earned it through merit rather than connections. "Remember," his assistant Tom said, "their cultural briefing said to never show too much emotion. The Empire values control above all else." James nodded, though he had already memorized every detail about the Empire's customs. He watched as their ship docked alongside vessels that looked more like living creatures or works of art than spacecraft. The welcome ceremony was exactly as grand as the briefings had suggested. The docking bay itself was larger than most Earth cities, with crystalline walls that seemed to contain entire galaxies within them. A group of Imperial officials waited for them, led by Master Ray, the Emperor's chief advisor. Their skin shimmered with embedded starlight, and their eyes held the wisdom of centuries. "Welcome to the heart of the Celestial Empire," Master Ray said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "We trust your journey was comfortable." "Very much so," James replied with a perfect bow. Not too deep to seem submissive, but respectful enough to show proper etiquette. Earth extends its gratitude for this opportunity. As they walked through the palace corridors, James noticed how other aliens stopped to stare at the humans, some with curiosity, others with barely hidden disdain. Humans were new to the galactic stage, and many species looked down on them. The tour ended at the diplomatic quarters, but before they could settle in, Master Ray pulled James aside. "There is a stellar ball tonight," he said. "All new species are expected to attend. The princess will be there." James had read about Princess Lyra. Her reputation for rejecting suitors was legendary even in Earth's limited galactic database. "I understand she's quite particular about diplomatic relations." Master Ray's expression showed a hint of amusement. "That's one way to put it. She has rejected 500 potential matches. Some were rulers of entire galactic arms." "Then I'll be sure to stay out of her way," James said with a slight smile. "Earth's interest is in trade and cultural exchange, not royal marriages." This seemed to catch Master Ray off guard. Usually, new species tried desperately to impress the princess. "You don't wish to court her favor." "My job is to represent Earth's interests," James replied simply. "Princess Lyra's personal life is her own business." Later that evening, James entered the grand ballroom, which put all of Earth's architectural achievements to shame. The ceiling was a living star map, showing real-time movements of galaxies. Aliens of all forms mingled, some floating, some phase-shifting, some existing in multiple dimensions at once. Then the princess entered, and the room fell silent. She was beautiful in a way that transcended species, her presence commanding attention without effort. Her eyes scanned the crowd, likely looking for the new human delegation. When her gaze fell on James, he did something that shocked the entire assembly. He simply nodded politely and turned back to his conversation with a quantum being about trade routes. For the first time in her life, Princess Lyra felt something she had never experienced before, the sting of being ignored. And she didn't like it one bit. Princess Lyra couldn't believe her eyes. The human diplomat had simply nodded at her and turned away, as if she were any ordinary person at the ball. No one had ever dared to show such indifference to her presence. She spent the next hour watching him from across the room. James moved through the crowd with surprising grace, discussing trade agreements with energy beings and cultural exchange with silicon-based life forms. Not once did he try to approach her or steal glances in her direction. "Tell me about the human," she commanded one of her attendants. James, Earth's diplomatic representative. Their records show he earned his position through skill rather than birth. He speaks 12 Earth languages and has already learned 4 galactic common tongues. Lyra frowned. That's not what I meant. Tell me about his weaknesses, his vices. Everyone has them. The attendant looked uncomfortable. He appears to be boring, Your Highness. He spends most of his time working or studying. No scandals, no secret relationships, no hidden agendas. This wouldn't do at all. Lyra smoothed her starlight dress and walked directly into James's path as he moved between conversations. You've been avoiding me, she said, her voice carrying just enough imperial command to make most beings tremble. James smiled politely. Not at all, Your Highness. I've been focusing on my diplomatic duties. Earth hopes to establish beneficial trade relationships with the Empire. Surely you can spare a moment for more personal discussions. She let a hint of stardust shimmer across her skin, a display that had made princes stutter and queens blush. I appreciate the offer, James replied, maintaining eye contact without a hint of being affected. But I believe the trade minister is waiting to discuss Earth's renewable energy technology, if you'll excuse me. He walked away, leaving Lyra standing there, mouth slightly open. Her attendants rushed to her side, expecting an outburst of royal anger. Instead, she laughed. How interesting. Finally, someone who isn't desperate for my attention. Over the next few days, Lyra did everything she could to provoke a reaction from James. She showed up at his diplomatic meetings, interrupted his discussions with other representatives, and even had him seated next to her at formal dinners. James remained unfailingly polite but professional. When she tried to distract him during negotiations, he stayed focused on the topic. When she made suggestive comments, he redirected the conversation to business matters. During one particularly important meeting about technology exchange, Lyra decided to make her move. You must find our advanced technology impressive, she said, interrupting his presentation. Earth is so far behind in many areas. James didn't miss a beat. Every civilization develops at its own pace, Your Highness. Earth may be younger, but we have our own unique contributions to offer. For instance, our approach to artificial intelligence ethics might interest you. And what could primitives teach us about ethics? She challenged, expecting him to finally show some anger. James smiled, and for the first time, there was a hint of steel in his voice. Perhaps the wisdom that true advancement isn't just about technology, but about how we treat others, regardless of their level of development. The room fell silent. No one had ever spoken to the princess this way. To everyone's surprise, Lyra didn't call for his arrest. Instead, her eyes sparkled with genuine interest. Well said, diplomat, she conceded. Please, continue your presentation. As James resumed talking about Earth's proposals, Lyra watched him with new eyes. Here was someone who didn't need her approval, didn't fear her power, and wasn't afraid to stand his ground. For the first time in her life, she found herself thinking about someone else before falling asleep. Not that she would ever admit it, of course. She was a princess of the Celestial Empire. She didn't get infatuated with humans, did she? The Imperial Library stretched for miles in every direction, its shelves containing knowledge from across the galaxy. Princess Lyra had never spent much time here before, but now she found herself walking through its endless aisles more and more often. The Regent sat at a desk near the ancient literature section, surrounded by both physical books and holographic texts. James had been spending his free time studying the Empire's history and culture, making careful notes in an old-fashioned paper notebook. Primitive writing tools? Lyra asked, materializing beside his desk in a shimmer of starlight. James didn't jump or show surprise at her sudden appearance. Sometimes the old ways have their own charm, he replied, not looking up from his work. The physical act of writing helps me remember things better. Lyra picked up one of the books he had been reading, a collection of imperial poetry from 1,000 years ago. I didn't expect a human to be interested in our classical literature. Your Third Dynasty poets had fascinating insights about the nature of consciousness and time, James said, finally looking up. especially interesting given that humans were still figuring out basic mathematics during that period. She sat down across from him, uninvited. "Read me your favorite passage." For the first time, she saw genuine enthusiasm in his eyes as he turned to a marked page. He read in perfect Imperial High language, his pronunciation flawless, capturing the complex rhythm that most aliens struggled with. "You've been practicing," she said, trying not to sound impressed. "Understanding a culture's art helps in understanding their people," he replied. "Though I admit, some of these concepts are beyond human comprehension. We don't experience time in multiple directions like your ancestors did." Lyra found herself drawn into a discussion about poetry, philosophy, and the differences between human and imperial perspectives. Hours passed like minutes. She hadn't had such an engaging conversation in decades. Over the next few weeks, Lyra made it her mission to accidentally encounter James everywhere. She learned his schedule, his habits, his interests. She discovered he spent early mornings in the palace gardens, studying the bioluminescent flowers. She found out he enjoyed classical music from all species, often attending concerts in the floating music halls. During one such concert, featuring a crystalline being performing songs using quantum vibrations, Lyra finally asked the question that had been bothering her. "Why aren't you trying to court me like everyone else?" James listened to the music for a moment before answering. "Would you respect me if I did?" The question caught her off guard. "What do you mean?" 500 suitors have tried to win you with gifts, flattery, and displays of power," he said. "None of them tried to know you as a person rather than a prize to be won." Lyra felt her face flush with stardust. "And you think you know me? I know you're brilliant but bored, powerful but lonely. You've seen everything the galaxy has to offer, yet you spend hours discussing ancient poetry with a primitive human." His eyes met hers. "I know you're looking for something real in a world of illusions." The music reached a crescendo, the quantum vibrations making reality itself shiver. Lyra found herself unable to look away from James's steady gaze. "You're very presumptuous for a human," she said softly. "Perhaps," he smiled, "or perhaps I'm just observant." Before she could respond, he stood up. "I have an early meeting tomorrow. Thank you for the company, Your Highness." As he left, Lyra realized something that both thrilled and terrified her. In all her centuries of life, no one had ever seen through her so clearly. No one had ever treated her as just herself. She watched his retreating figure and made a decision. If he wouldn't court her, then she would have to court him. The very thought should have been beneath her dignity as a princess. But somehow, she didn't care anymore. The royal gardens bloomed with flowers from 1,000 worlds, but Princess Lyra couldn't focus on their beauty. She paced among the floating lotus blossoms, her dress trailing stardust in her wake. "This is ridiculous," she muttered to herself. "He's just a human, a primitive being who probably won't live past a century." But her mind kept returning to their conversations in the library, the way he challenged her thoughts without fear, how his eyes crinkled slightly when he found something amusing. Master Ray found her destroying gravitational roses with bursts of frustrated energy. "The flowers are innocent, Your Highness," he said mildly. "I can't stop thinking about him," she blurted out. "Me, a princess of the Celestial Empire, obsessing over a human who spends his time reading old books and taking notes with primitive tools. Is it the human that bothers you?" Master Ray asked, "or the fact that you finally found someone who sees past your title?" Lyra froze mid-stride. "I don't know what you mean. In all my years serving the Empire, I've never seen you spend so much time with anyone. You've attended more diplomatic meetings in the past month than in the last century." "I'm just making sure Earth doesn't get too many trade advantages," she said weakly. "Of course," Master Ray smiled. "It has nothing to do with their chief diplomat." Later that day, Lyra found herself watching James in a negotiation session. He was discussing the exchange of Earth's environmental restoration technology for access to Imperial energy systems. "Earth's methods may seem simple," he was saying, "but sometimes the most elegant solutions don't require reality-bending technology." She noticed things she'd been trying to ignore. The confidence in his voice, the intelligence in his arguments, the way other diplomats listened when he spoke. For a human, he was. No, she whispered to herself. I am not falling for a human. But then he looked up and caught her eye, giving her that small, knowing smile that made her heart do very unprincess-like flips. During a break in the negotiations, James approached her. Your Highness, I've been meaning to ask you something. Her pulse quickened. Yes. Could you explain why you've attended every single trade negotiation this month? It's causing some concern among other species about imperial favoritism toward Earth. Lyra felt her face heat up. I am just doing my duty as princess. Are you? He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Because I've been watching you too, Your Highness, and I think we both know there's more to it than duty. You dare to presume. She started, but he cut her off. I dare to be honest, something you might want to try. With yourself, if no one else. He walked away, leaving her speechless for the second time in her life. Both times because of him. That night, unable to sleep, Lyra floated in her quantum meditation chamber, facing the truth she'd been avoiding. She, Princess Lyra of the Celestial Empire, who had rejected beings of pure energy and rulers of galaxy clusters, had fallen in love with a human who read poetry and wrote with ink. What am I going to do? She asked the universe at large. The universe, in its infinite wisdom, did not reply. But somewhere in the diplomatic quarters, James sat at his desk, writing in his notebook about a princess who tried so hard to be perfect that she'd forgotten how to be real. And for the first time in her long life, Lyra didn't care about being perfect. She just wanted to be herself, even if that meant being in love with someone her younger self would have dismissed without a second thought. The stars wheeled overhead, and the princess of the Celestial Empire admitted to herself what she'd been denying for weeks. She had fallen for a human. And there was no going back. The Imperial Palace's Grand Hall buzzed with activity during the annual Celestial Summit. Representatives from every major species gathered to discuss galactic politics. Emperor Vale sat on his crystal throne, with Princess Lyra beside him. James stood among the Earth delegation, his attention focused on the trade agreements being discussed. He noticed something odd, a slight distortion in the air near the Emperor's throne, like a heat wave in summer. His human eyes, less adapted to the spectrum shifts common in alien technology, caught what others missed. Years of diplomatic training had taught him to notice small details. Your Majesty, he called out suddenly, breaking protocol. Move. The Emperor looked up, startled by the human's outburst. In that split second, James launched himself forward, covering an impossible distance with pure human adrenaline. He tackled the Emperor just as a beam of concentrated dark energy sliced through where Vale had been sitting. Chaos erupted. Guards materialized from quantum space. Diplomats scattered. The assassin, using advanced cloaking technology, became visible, a shadow form being from the outer rim. Princess Lyra watched in horror as the assassin fired again. But James, still moving with that strange human speed that even their advanced sensors struggled to track, grabbed a ceremonial mirror shield from the wall. The dark energy beam reflected back, striking the assassin. Medical team, James shouted, already checking the Emperor for injuries, and secure all exits. Vale looked at the human with newfound respect. You saved my life. But how did you see the assassin? Humans may be primitive, James said, helping the Emperor up, but our pattern recognition evolved to spot predators. The cloaking technology created a slight distortion that matched known assassination techniques in Earth's historical records. Lyra rushed to her father's side, her usual composure shattered. Father, are you? I'm fine, thanks to our human friend. Vale turned to James. You risked your life for mine. Why? Because it was right, James said simply. Earth values life. All life, regardless of species or status. Before anyone could respond, more shadow forms materialized. They had planned for this, waiting for the confusion after the first attempt. "Get the Emperor to safety," someone shouted. But they were surrounded. The shadow forms moved like liquid darkness, their weapons charged with enough power to destroy the palace. Then James did something that showed why humans had survived despite their technological limitations. He improvised. "Lyra," he called, dropping all formality. "The chandelier crystals. They're quantum-linked to the shield generators, aren't they?" She understood immediately. Using her imperial powers, she shattered the massive crystal chandelier. James grabbed a shard, angled it precisely, and threw it into the path of a shadow form's weapon blast. The crystal's quantum properties amplified the energy, creating a cascading reaction that overloaded the assassin's cloaking devices. They became visible, vulnerable. Imperial guards moved in, capturing the exposed attackers. In moments, the crisis was over. "That was either brilliant or insane," Lyra said, approaching James. "Humans tend to be both." He smiled, then winced. A stray energy beam had grazed his arm. Lyra's hands glowed as she healed his wound. "You could have died. Why take such a risk?" "Some things are worth the risk," he said softly, looking into her eyes. The moment was interrupted by urgent voices. Representatives from rival factions were already arguing, some claiming Earth had staged the attack to gain favor. "This is why we can't trust primitive species in our affairs," a quantum being declared. Emperor Vale raised his hand for silence. "The human saved my life using quick thinking and courage. Perhaps it's time we reconsidered what we label as primitive." But politics, even in the far future, moved slowly. Despite James's heroism, there were those who couldn't accept a human gaining such prominence in imperial affairs. As Lyra watched James calmly handle the accusations in politics, she made a decision. She would no longer hide her feelings behind royal protocol. It was time to make a stand, even if it meant challenging 10,000 years of tradition. The imperial court gathered for what they thought would be another routine session. The massive chamber, with its ceiling of living stars and walls of pure energy, held representatives from every corner of the galaxy. Princess Lyra stood before the assembled dignitaries, her father watching curiously from his throne. James sat with the Earth delegation, his face carefully neutral. "For 10,000 years, Lyra began, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast chamber, "our empire has valued tradition above all. We believed advancement meant moving beyond what we saw as primitive." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. This was not the usual court procedure. "I have rejected 500 suitors," she continued. "Beings of pure energy, rulers of vast domains, creatures who could bend reality itself. I rejected them because they all showed me the same thing: power without wisdom, advancement without understanding." She turned to look at James, who sat straighter but maintained his diplomatic composure. Then a human arrived, a being from a species we considered primitive. "He saved my father's life, not with advanced technology, but with observation and courage. He earned respect not through power, but through understanding." The chamber erupted in whispers. Some nobles looked outraged, others intrigued. "Your Highness," a quantum being spoke up, "surely you're not suggesting—" "I am not suggesting anything," Lyra interrupted. "I am declaring my choice. I choose James of Earth as my consort." The chamber exploded into chaos. Energy beings flickered in agitation, crystalline entities vibrated with shock, and multidimensional beings shifted through various states of disbelief. James stood, his movement drawing all eyes. "Your Highness," he said calmly, "may I speak?" Lyra nodded, trying to hide her nervousness. This was the moment. Would he accept? "For months," James began, "I've watched Princess Lyra. Not as a suitor, but as a diplomat trying to understand the Empire. I saw her intelligence, her strength, but also her loneliness. She had everything except someone who saw her as herself." He walked forward, each step measured and confident. I didn't try to court her because I believed she deserved more than another person seeking power. Instead, I shared my thoughts, my culture, my understanding of the universe, and in doing so, I found someone extraordinary. James stopped before Lyra, looking into her eyes. I accept your choice, Your Highness, not because you're a princess, but because you're you. Emperor Vale stood, his presence commanding immediate silence. The law allows the princess to choose any being she deems worthy. James has proven his worth not through power, but through actions. I approve this union. The declaration was final. Tradition and law had been satisfied. 5 years later, the empire flourished under a new philosophy. Earth's primitive approaches combined with imperial technology created solutions no one had imagined possible. James and Lyra's partnership became legendary, not for its controversy, but for the changes it brought. In their private garden, away from the politics and ceremony, Lyra found James at his usual spot, writing in his notebook. Still using primitive tools, she teased. Some old ways are worth keeping, he smiled, pulling her down for a kiss. Do you ever regret it? She asked. Giving up a normal human life to be with me. James looked at her, his eyes full of the same warmth that had first made her realize power wasn't everything. Normal is overrated. I prefer extraordinary. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient dance, unchanged by the politics of empires or the love between a human and a princess. But in their light, two beings from vastly different worlds had found something rare in any galaxy, a love based not on power or tradition, but on seeing each other for who they truly were. And that, as both humans and the empire came to understand, was the most advanced achievement of all.